Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today's going to be a heavy one.
Yeah.
We are looking at the machinery under the hood of American democracy.
Yeah.
And I don't mean the civics textbook version. I mean the actual grinding gears of how power is gained, held, and consolidated.
Yeah, we are tackling the big systemic question today. It's the one that I think lurks in the back of everyone's mind when they, doom scroll through the news. We have these institutions that feel granite solid, the Constitution, the Supreme Court, all the shiny buildings in D.C., but then there's this creeping sense of vulnerability.
Right.
So the core inquiry is, how do these democratic institutions become vulnerable to authoritarian consolidation?
And that is a frightening question because the assumption has always been that the institutions are there to prevent that.
Exactly.
But we are going to look at how narrative control, polarization, and the strategic redefinition of language can actually turn those institutions against democracy itself.
And the book we're using as our map for this is Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by Heather Cox Richardson.
A fantastic choice for this kind of systems analysis.
It really is. And I want to set the ground rules right now, because usually when people hear books about American politics, they expect a play-by-play of the last election, or they expect a hit piece on a specific candidate.
Right. Here's why this guy is bad, or here's why that campaign failed.
Exactly. This isn't that. We are not here to relitigate 2020 or 2024 or whatever comes next. We are doing a pattern recognition exercise.
Yes.
We are looking for the software code that runs the system, regardless of which specific politician is currently acting as the avatar.
That's the perfect way to frame it. And why this matters, and why we chose this specific book for systems analysis, is that Richardson argues this isn't just about winning votes. It is about legitimacy.
Legitimacy.
It's about historical memory. And ultimately, it is about the mechanics of minority rule. How do you convince a population to abandon the democratic norms that actually protect them?
That's the big question. So let's start with the author, just to orient ourselves. Who is Heather Cox Richardson? I know she has this massive following online.
She does. She writes a newsletter called Letters from an American, which, millions of people read every day.
Yeah.
But before she was a Substack star, she was and is a very serious historian of American political development.
Right.
She spends her life in the archives, reading 19th century letters and congressional records. That's her bread and butter.
Which is important because she's not coming at this as a pundit who needs a hot take for cable news. She's coming at it as someone who sees ghosts everywhere. She sees the 1850s in the 2020s.
She sees the patterns, the echoes, and her central thesis in Democracy Awakening is something that challenges a very, very core American belief.
Which is what?
We are raised on this idea of progress. The arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. Things get better. We went from slavery to freedom, from no vote to women voting. It's a straight line up.
Right, the Star Trek future. We're just moving toward a more perfect union, slowly but surely.
Richardson says, no, that is a myth. The reality of American history is an oscillation. It is a cycle.
An oscillation.
We have periods of egalitarian expansion where we let more people into the club, so to speak, and those are almost immediately followed by a fierce, organized, hierarchical backlash.
So it's two steps forward, one massive, organized step back.
Sometimes two steps back. She frames it as this fundamental struggle between two conflicting American foundings that happened at the same time.
Okay, what are the two foundings?
On one hand, you have the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. That's the promise, the ideal. But existing in the exact same moment, in the exact same geography, you have the hierarchical structures of enslavement and oligarchy.
The people writing all men are created equal owned other human beings.
Precisely. And that contradiction isn't a bug. She argues it's the central feature of the system. The system has always been at war with itself. And the thesis of the book is that authoritarian movements in the U.S. don't just fall out of the sky. They don't appear from nowhere.
They're a feature, not a bug.
They are. And they utilize distorted history and redefined language to justify exclusion. They make minority rule feel like a defensive tradition.
Okay, I want to get into the machinery of that, because the book lays out these distinct system patterns, and the first one completely blew my mind because it changes how I understand the political labels we use every single day. We're calling this system pattern 1, the redefinition of conservatism.
This is where we have to do some time travel. If you ask someone today what a conservative is, What do you think they'd say?
Oh, someone who wants low taxes, small government, hates regulations, maybe it's socially traditional, anti-big government is the main thing.
Right, government is the problem. But Richardson points out that this definition is actually a modern invention. It's shockingly new.
How new?
Historically, going back to someone like Edmund Burke in the 18th century, conservatism meant something totally different. It meant stability. It meant you believed that society was a complex web of traditions and institutions. And if you ripped them up too fast like the French revolutionaries did, you'd get chaos and terror. So you had to conserve those institutions.
So a conservative in, say, 1860 or 1900 might actually love the government because the government is an institution that provides stability.
Exactly. In fact, Abraham Lincoln called himself a conservative.
Wait, what? Lincoln? How does that work?
He argued that he was trying to conserve the principles of the Declaration of Independence against the radical revolutionary innovation of the Confederacy. The Confederates were the ones trying to tear up the system and create something new based on racial hierarchy.
Wow. So the radicals were the ones trying to break the Union. Lincoln was trying to conserve it.
Precisely. So the big question is, how do we get from conserving the system to government is the problem?
Yeah, that's a huge leap.
We have to look at 1937. Richardson pinpoints this as the pivot. We are deep in the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is in the White House. The New Deal is in full swing.
Right. So the government is suddenly everywhere. It's building dams, regulating banks, setting labor standards, creating Social Security.
And two groups of people are absolutely panicking. Group one, the northern business tycoons, the industrialists, the bankers. They hate the New Deal because it's regulating their businesses and empowering unions. They feel like their property rights are under attack.
Okay, that makes sense. Standard business opposition.
Oh.
Who's group two?
Southern Democrats. Now, you have to remember, in 1937, the South is a one-party state run by white segregationists. They're Democrats, but they're a very different kind of Democrat.
Okay.
And they hate the New Deal for a completely different reason. They are terrified that if the federal government gets powerful enough to regulate wages in a factory, it might eventually get powerful enough to dismantle Jim Crow, to enforce voting rights.
So it's a threat to their entire social order.
Their entire racial hierarchy. So you have Wall Street Republicans who are worried about their money and Mississippi segregationists who are worried about their racial caste system. On paper, they shouldn't be friends.
They should be enemies.
They should. But they realized they had a shared enemy. Federal intervention. The business owner didn't want the feds checking his books. The segregationist didn't want the feds checking his voting rolls.
So they formed an alliance, a coalition of convenience.
Exactly. And in 1937, this coalition released a document called the Conservative Manifesto.
Okay, this sounds important.
It's the moment the dictionary gets rewritten. It completely rebrands conservatism. It strips away the whole social stability part, the Burkean part, and replaces it with an ideology that is defined almost entirely by its opposition to government regulation and social safety nets.
So it's no longer about conserving institutions, it's about dismantling them.
It's about dismantling the New Deal state. And it framed the liberal consensus, which is just the basic idea that the government should keep people from starving and regulate the excesses of capitalism, as a fundamental threat to freedom.
This is a crucial linguistic shift, isn't it? Freedom gets redefined. It stops being freedom from want or freedom from fear, which is what FDR talked about.
And it becomes freedom of the wealthy to do what they want with their capital, and freedom of the local white hierarchy to do what they want with their population.
That is incredibly cynical. But from a strategic point of view, it's brilliant.
It's genius.
Because if you say, I want to oppress people and hoard wealth, you're the bad guy. But if you say, I am fighting for freedom against a tyrannous bureaucracy, you're a hero. You're a patriot.
Bingo. That is the narrative capture. And this created a political identity built entirely on opposing the liberal consensus. This is the seed of what Richardson calls movement conservatism. It's a distinct species from traditional republicanism. It's an ideology.
It seems like language is the primary weapon here, which brings us right to system pattern 2. If system 1 was redefining conservatism, system 2 is the weaponization of the word socialism.
This one hit me hard because we hear this word every single day. If a city council wants to put in a bike lane, someone in the comments calls it socialism. If we want to fund a library, it's socialism.
I always just assumed this was a hangover from the Cold War. You know, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, fighting the Soviets. That's where that panic came from.
That's what I thought, too. It seems logical. But Richardson traces it back way, way further. She argues that the American panic over socialism predates the Cold War. It even predates the Bolshevik Revolution. It goes back to 1871.
1871. Okay, so we are talking about Reconstruction. The Civil War has been over for 6 years.
Right. And the South is in turmoil. The federal government has come in, and for the first time in American history, formerly enslaved black men have the right to vote.
And not just vote, but they can hold office.
Yes. In some states, they were the majority. In South Carolina, the majority of the lower house of the legislature was African American. Now, you need to put yourself in the shoes of the white plantation owner class.
Okay.
For centuries, they have held all the power and all the wealth. Suddenly, their former property is writing the laws.
That must have felt like the world had been turned completely upside down.
It did. And here's the economic kicker. These newly enfranchised black citizens were poor. They had been enslaved. They owned literally nothing. But now they had political power. And what did they vote for?
I'm guessing they voted for things that would help them catch up, things the community needed.
Exactly. They voted for public schools. They'd never had them. They voted for roads. They voted for hospitals. They voted for basic infrastructure.
Which sounds like, that just sounds like democracy.
It is democracy. But here is the problem. Infrastructure costs money. Where does that money come from?
Taxes.
Taxes. And who had all the property to tax?
The white landowners, the same people who just lost all their political power.
Exactly. So the white landowners looked at this dynamic and they created a narrative, a story to explain what was happening. They argued that if you let poor people, and they were very specific, they meant black men, if you let them vote, they will inevitably use their vote to redistribute wealth from the makers, the landowners, to the takers.
And they called that socialism. In 1871.
They explicitly called it socialism. There was a popular magazine at the time, Harper's Weekly, that ran a cartoon calling the South Carolina legislature Socialism in South Carolina.
That is just wild. Karl Marx is barely a blip on the radar. The Soviet Union is 50 years in the future. And they're using this term to describe building a school.
They're using it to describe taxation for public benefit. And this is the key insight in the book. The fear wasn't about the government seizing the factories or the means of production. That wasn't even on the table. The fear was that democracy would function as intended.
That the majority would vote for their own interests.
Correct. And this gave them a kind of moral cover for disenfranchisement. They didn't have to say, we are racists who don't want black people to vote. That sounds bad even in 1871. Instead, they could say, we are fiscally responsible taxpayers who are trying to stop socialism.
We're not racist. We're just protecting the treasury.
Exactly. It framed voting restrictions, poll taxes, literacy tests, all of it, as a way to protect the taxpayer from the looting of the poor.
That narrative tool is still running today. It's the exact same software. When you hear arguments about why we shouldn't have universal health care or free college, it's often framed as, why should I have to pay for them?
It atomizes society. It breaks the idea of a community, of a commonwealth. It turns citizenship into a transactional relationship where if you aren't paying the most in taxes, your vote is somehow suspect.
Which is a perfect segue to system pattern 3, because if you are going to break the idea of community, you need a new hero. You need a symbol of hyper-individualism. And Richardson says, enter the cowboy.
The cowboy, the ultimate American icon, rugged, self-reliant.
Oh, yeah. I grew up loving Westerns. The lone figure on the horizon. He doesn't need the police. He has a six-shooter. He doesn't need a job. He has the open range. He is completely, totally self-sufficient.
That is the myth. Yeah. That is the image. And Richardson argues that this myth was cultivated and weaponized specifically to counter the liberal consensus. In the post-WWII era, the 50s and 60s, the government was a positive force in many people's lives. It was building the interstate highway system. The GI Bill was sending millions to college. There was a sense of collective effort. The opposition needed an image to sell the idea that depending on the government makes you weak.
Be a man, be a cowboy, don't take a handout.
Exactly. But the reality check in the book is brutal. And for anyone who loves the mythology of the West, brace yourself.
Okay, hit me with it.
The actual historical cowboy of the late 19th century. He was a low-wage industrial worker.
Ouch. Okay. Not so glamorous.
It gets worse. He was working in an industry, the cattle industry, that was almost entirely dependent on and subsidized by the federal government.
What? How does that work?
Think about it. Who cleared the land of the Plains tribes to make way for the cattle drives? The U.S. Army.
Federal entity.
Who built the forts that provided the markets for beef and the protection from raids? The federal government. Who gave massive land grants to the railroads that allowed the beef to get from Kansas to the slaughterhouses in Chicago?
The federal government.
The federal government. The entire industry existed because of federal intervention, federal land, and federal military power.
So the cowboy is actually a government-subsidized employee working on federal land protected by federal troops, moving a product on a federally subsidized railroad.
Essentially, yes. And purely demographically, the Hollywood version is a total lie. Historians estimate that about a third of the cowboys on the long drives were men of color, black, Mexican, indigenous. They were marginalized people doing hard, dangerous labor for very little money.
But the myth erased all the color, all the community, and all the government support. It gave us John Wayne, a white man alone, beholden to no one.
And that myth serves a function. It appeals to our vanity. We all want to believe we are the hero of our own movie. We don't want to think of ourselves as people who need a safety net or a community, so voters will identify with the cowboy image and vote against their own economic interests.
I don't need a union, I'm a cowboy.
Exactly. Even if you were working a grueling shift at an Amazon warehouse, the narrative convinces you that collective action is for the weak. It effectively weaponizes your own identity against your wallet.
It's amazing how these narratives stack on top of each other. You redefine conservatism to protect the wealthy, you use socialism to scare people away from public goods, and you use the cowboy to make them feel good about being on their own.
Right.
But to make all that stick, you need to control the past itself, which is system pattern 4, the construction of a false past.
This is a universal feature of these kinds of movements. Authoritarian movements, regardless of where they are in the world, always rely on a golden age, a time before the chaos, a time when everyone knew their place and things were good.
Make America great again implies a specific again that we need to return to.
It does. And the system design here is to create a fantasy version of the past where hierarchy was natural and order prevailed. Richardson points out that when the present feels chaotic, and it often feels chaotic because rights are expanding for women or minorities, which disrupts the old order, that false past becomes a powerful refuge.
It's a safe space. Take me back to the 1950s.
But a sanitized, leave it to beaver 1950s where black people were happy in their place and women loved being housewives. Not the real 1950s of redlining, segregation, and limited opportunity.
The book brings up this very modern conflict between the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission as a perfect example of this.
This is the battlefield of the false past. The 1619 Project, led by Nickel Hannah-Jones for the New York Times, attempted to reframe American histories by centering slavery and the contributions of black Americans as a foundational element of the U.S. It said, look, the hierarchy and the hypocrisy were there from the very start.
And the reaction to that from some corners was absolutely explosive.
It was visceral, because it popped the bubble of the false past. It challenged the story of pristine, perfect founders. So the Trump administration responded by creating the 1776 Commission. Richardson analyzes this as a systemic attempt to enforce a patriotic education.
Which basically means a history class where we don't talk about the bad stuff.
It means a history where the founders were flawless demigods, the system was divinely inspired, and any critique of it, any mention of slavery or genocide, is an attack on America itself. It's unpatriotic.
It connects back to that feedback loop. If the past was perfect, then any change is degeneration. Any progress is actually decay.
Correct. And if you can convince people that the real America is this false past, then anyone trying to change things, anyone trying to push for equality for all, is by definition un-American.
It's an attack on the country.
And it justifies silencing them. It can even justify violence. Because you aren't attacking a political opponent with a different idea. You are defending the sacred timeline from an enemy.
Which brings us to the nuts and bolts. Because you can have all these powerful narratives, but eventually you need to hold power. And if your policies like cutting Social Security or environmental protections or banning abortion are actually unpopular with the majority, how do you win?
You can't. Not in a fair fight.
So this is System Pattern 5, Minority Rule Mechanisms.
This is where the rubber meets the road. Richardson argues that the liberal consensus is actually still very popular.
Meaning, if you poll Americans and you ask, do you want clean air and clean water? Do you want a minimum wage? Do you want your grandparents to have Social Security? They say yes.
Overwhelmingly. Across party lines. So the movement conservatives have a fundamental problem. They cannot win a straight-up popularity contest. Their policy agenda benefits a small, wealthy minority.
So if you can't win the majority of votes, what do?
The system incentivizes you to capture the counter-majoritarian institutions.
We're talking about the Senate, where Wyoming has the same power as California, the Electoral College, where you can lose the popular vote and still win the presidency, and maybe most importantly, the Supreme Court.
Especially the Supreme Court. The book goes deep into the rise of a legal theory called originalism.
Okay, we need to unpack originalism, because on the surface, it sounds like a reasonable thing. Let's just do what the Constitution says. What's wrong with that?
That's the branding, and it's very effective. But think about what it actually means. Originalism is the idea that we should interpret the law based on the original public understanding of the men who wrote it in 1787.
The men who wore powdered wigs, who didn't know what a germ was, and who excluded women, indigenous people, and people of color from citizenship, that's our baseline.
That's the baseline. So if you say we can only recognize rights that were deeply rooted in the history and tradition of 1787 or maybe 1868, you are baking the hierarchy of the past into the laws of the present.
It's a time machine designed to strip away rights that have been won over the last century.
It is a mechanism to bypass the will of the current majority. If 70% of Americans want abortion access, it doesn't matter. If the history and tradition of 1868 didn't protect it, then the 70% lose. That is the definition of minority rule.
And this connects to gerrymandering in the states, right? It's all one system.
It's a vicious feedback loop. Yeah. You use the Supreme Court to gut the Voting Rights Act. That allows states to gerrymander their electoral maps into these crazy, unrepresentative shapes. Those rigged maps send representatives to Washington who don't have to worry about general elections, only their primary base.
So they become more and more extreme.
And those extreme representatives are the ones who confirm the judges who will gut the next voting rights law, keeping the whole cycle going.
It's a closed loop, a self-perpetuating machine.
It's a fortress built against the will of the majority.
I want to zoom out and do our systems mapping. We've talked about these patterns, but let's look at the actors and incentives explicitly. Let's put the pieces on the board. Who are the players here?
The primary actors, the drivers of this change, are the movement conservatives, and we need to be really clear to distinguish them from traditional Republicans like an Eisenhower or even a Richard Nixon who expanded the EPA.
Right.
Movement conservatives are revolutionaries. Their stated goal is to dismantle the New Deal state entirely.
They want to burn it down and go back to a pre-1937 world.
A world with very little regulation and no social safety net. Then you have the marginalized groups, and Richardson frames them in a really interesting way, not as victims, but as the actual engine of American democracy.
That's a fascinating flip. Usually they are presented as people asking for help from the system.
Richardson argues that because they were excluded from the system, they were the ones who actually took the words of the Declaration of Independence seriously. When Fannie Lou Hamer or the suffragists or LGBTQ activists demanded rights, they were forcing the country to align its reality with its rhetoric. They are the custodians of the democratic value.
They're the ones holding the country accountable to its own promises.
Exactly. And then, of course, a huge actor is the media ecosystem. From 1930s pamphleteering to modern talk radio, she mentions Rush Limbaugh's impact in the 90s, and then to cable news like Fox News.
And the narratives running on that system, the software, we touched on socialism, but there is another term in the notes that's really chilling, the mudsill theory. This sounds like something from a construction site.
It is. It's a term that comes from James Henry Hammond, a South Carolina senator in the 1850s, a fierce defender of slavery.
Okay.
He gave this famous speech where he argued that for any great civilization to exist, for there to be art and progress and high culture, there has to be a class of people at the bottom doing the drudgery, the menial labor.
The sill in the mud. The foundation that's designed to rot so the house above it can stand.
That's the exact metaphor. He argued this was a natural law. You need a mudsill. In the 1850s, he used this to justify slavery. He said, look, someone has to be in the mud. Better them than us.
That is just, it's horrifying.
It is. But Richardson maps this directly to modern rhetoric. When you hear the phrase makers versus takers, or the idea that some people are job creators and everyone else is just a drain on resources, that is mudsill theory 2.0.
It's the same logic.
It's the belief that hierarchy isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's necessary for civilization to progress.
And states' rights fits in here, too. I always thought that was a principled philosophical stance. I just believe in local control over federal control.
The book argues it's not a principle, it's a fluid tool. It's a tactic that is only used when the federal government is trying to enforce equality.
Give me an example of that.
The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The southern states, the supposed champions of states' rights, demanded that the federal government use its immense power to force northern states like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts to return escaped slaves. They trampled all over the rights of those states because they wanted their property back.
So they loved big government when it was acting as their private security guard.
Absolutely. When the feds enforce hierarchy, they love it. When the feds enforce equality, suddenly it's tyranny. It's not a principle, it's a weapon.
Let's move to the present-day implications, because Richardson brings this history right up to the modern era and the Trump presidency specifically. And she uses some very specific terms to describe the tactics of modern authoritarianism.
She does. And she starts with a term we hear a lot, but she defines it very precisely. Gaslighting.
Now, this is a word that gets overused on the internet. My boyfriend gaslighted me because he ate the last slice of pizza.
Chuckles. Right. It's contrivialized. But in political science terms, it has a specific and dangerous meaning. She references the original Ingrid Bergman film, Gaslight.
Remind us what happens in that movie.
A husband is slowly manipulating the environment. He's dimming the gas lights in the house every night. And when his wife asks, are the lights dimmer? He says, no, you're imagining it. You're being hysterical. You're going crazy.
So it's not just lying. It's an assault on her perception of reality.
It's an assault on reality itself. It is forcing the audience to abandon their own sensory evidence, their own eyes and ears, to remain loyal to the leader. If I can make you agree to something that is obviously false, like, say, the size of an inauguration crowd, when you can literally see the photographic evidence, I have demonstrated my power over you.
It's a dominance ritual. It's a loyalty test. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?
Precisely. And if you accept the lie, you are signaling that your loyalty to the leader and the movement is more important than objective truth. That is the absolute foundation of an authoritarian regime.
And then there's the big lie.
This is a concept with Nazi origins, which is a scary thought. The idea is that if you tell a small lie, people might catch you, they'll fact-check it. But if you tell a lie so colossal, so audacious, like the entire national election was stolen by a global conspiracy of voting machines and dead voters, people are more likely to believe it because they think, well, no one would make that up. It's too big to be a lie.
It just shortcuts the skepticism circuits in the human brain.
It does. And it is reinforced by a tactic called flooding the zone. This is a phrase attributed to Steve Bannon. The strategy is you don't try to hide the truth with one lie. You just dump so much sewage, so much noise, so many conflicting scandals and conspiracies into the media ecosystem that people just give up.
They just get exhausted. I don't know what's true anymore, so I'll just tune out and trust my guy.
Cynicism is the autocrat's best friend. If people believe that everyone is corrupt and nothing is true, they won't fight for democracy because they won't believe it's worth fighting for.
The book also mentions something called Schedule F. This sounds like a boring tax form, but the implication is terrifying.
It was an executive order drafted and nearly implemented at the end of the Trump presidency. The goal was to reclassify tens of thousands of career civil servants. We're talking about scientists at the EPA, analysts at the State Department, even weather forecasters, as political appointees so they could be fired at will.
This is the war on the deep state.
But you have to ask, what is the deep state in reality? It's institutional knowledge. It's the people who know how to inspect a bridge so it doesn't collapse. It's the people who track hurricanes. It's the nonpartisan expertise that keeps the country running, regardless of who is president. Schedule F is an attempt to turn that entire bureaucracy into a loyalty machine.
So you could fire the meteorologist at the National Weather Service if he refuses to use a Sharpie to change a hurricane map to fit the leader's statement.
That is the perfect example. You replace competence with loyalty? That is how institutions collapse from the inside out.
This connects directly to our channel's whole theme, crisis in perception. Richardson is arguing that we are perceiving the threat all wrong.
Completely. We tend to focus on the individual. We focus on Trump the man, his personality, his rallies, his tweets. Richardson argues that is a fundamental mistake. Trump is not a singular aberration. He is the logical outcome of the post-1937 movement conservative system.
He's the symptom, not the virus.
He is the avatar of a system that has been building this machine for 80 years. The narrative machine, the legal machine, the polarization machine. He just stepped into the cockpit of a vehicle that was already built and fueled.
And the language of mechanism, calling everything socialism, calling everything an attack on freedom, it has successfully rewired how millions of Americans perceive their own interests.
Which explains why facts don't work. I see this all the time online and in real life. People try to fact-check the narratives. They'll say, actually, crime is down in your city. Or, actually, the economy is growing under this policy.
And it just bounces right off. It doesn't stick.
Because the narrative isn't about data. It's about identity. When you have tied your personal identity to a hierarchical worldview, When you believe that your status as a real American is under attack from immigrants or liberals or whoever, a factual correction feels like a punch in the face. It feels like a personal attack on your self-worth.
You're not attacking the fact, you're attacking me.
Exactly. And people will reject a fact to protect their identity every single time.
So we have covered some really dark territory. The 1937 backlash, the weaponization of language, the construction of a false past, the mechanics of minority rule. Let's move to the conclusion. What does Democracy Awakening leave us with? Is it just game over, we're doomed?
No. And this is the awakening part of the title. It's not a book of despair. Richardson argues that we need to reevaluate what American exceptionalism really means.
Usually that phrase is used to mean America is the best, we're special, we are immune to dictators and things that happen in other countries.
Right. And clearly we are not immune. We have had these powerful authoritarian currents here since the very beginning. But Richardson argues we are exceptional for a different reason. We are exceptional because of that other founding, because marginalized people have repeatedly used the language of the Declaration of Independence to force the country to change.
They held up the mirror to the nation's ideals.
They did. They said, you wrote this down. All men are created equal. Now make it true. The awakening happens when the majority of people realize the system has been rigged against them by a small, powerful minority.
So the crisis in perception is that moment the veil lifts. When you see the gears turning behind the curtain.
When you realize that democracy isn't a static object you inherit from your grandparents like a pocket watch. It's not a thing. It is a verb. It is a constant grinding, day-by-day struggle against the natural entropy of hierarchy and authoritarian drift.
So if you start pushing, the boulder rolls back down the hill.
Every single time. There is no final victory. There is only the continuous struggle.
That is a really powerful place to land. It's not optimistic in a cheap, easy way, but it gives us a job to do. It gives us agency.
It creates agency. If the system was built by people, it can be unbuilt and rebuilt by people. Nothing is permanent.
We want to give full credit where it is due. This entire deep dive and analysis is based on the book Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by Heather Cox Richardson.
It is a dense, fascinating read. We've really just pulled out the main structural threads today. But the historical weave, the specific stories, the letters she quotes, the depth of detail is truly worth your time. Go read the book or get it from your library.
Absolutely. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
And if you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Stay curious.